Story 1. The cold wind whistled through the trees as I arrived at the remote cabin, my snowmobile leaving a faint trail in the thick snow. The cabin, small and worn from years of harsh winters, stood alone in the middle of the endless white landscape. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple getaway built by my grandparents. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me, and felt the silence wrap around me like a heavy blanket. The only sound was the soft crackling of the wood stove as I lit it up, the warm glow slowly filling the cold, empty space. I unpacked my things, feeling a sense of relief. Out here, there were no distractions, no crowds, just peace and quiet. The weight of everyday life slowly melted away, replaced by the stillness of the wilderness. Through the small window I could see the snow falling gently, covering the ground like a thick white carpet. Everything was calm, exactly the way I wanted it to be. But as I stood there, looking out at the untouched snow, a strange feeling crept into my chest. It felt too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that made you second-guess yourself. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. With a deep breath, I settled in for the night, unaware that something or someone might be out there in the snow, watching. The morning air was crisp and biting as I stepped outside to gather firewood. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness around me. But as I reached the shed, something unusual caught my eye. Footprints. They stretched from the tree line all the way to the front of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at them, my breath fogging up in the freezing air. The tracks were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, and what unsettled me the most, there were no footprints leading away. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting around the empty woods, scanning for any sign of movement. The trees stood still, their bare branches swaying slightly in the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. Someone had come right up to my cabin while I was asleep. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal, a lost hiker, or something far worse? I followed the footprints cautiously, each step making my pulse race. They led deeper into the woods, away from the only road that led to the cabin. The path was long and winding, disappearing into the thick trees. The further I walked, the more I realized how alone I really was. No cell signal, no neighbors, just endless snow and towering pines. A sudden noise stopped me in my tracks, a faint crunch, like a footstep just beyond the trees. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stood frozen, listening. The silence stretched on, but I knew what I heard. Someone, or something, was out there. A cold chill crept down my spine as I turned back toward the cabin, feeling eyes on me the entire way. Back inside the cabin, I locked the door and stood by the window, staring out into the endless white landscape. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just an animal or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The footprints. They came right up to the door. Whoever made them had been standing right there, just inches away from where I had been sleeping. I tried to calm my racing thoughts by tending to the fire, stacking logs carefully into the stove, but every creak of the cabin made me jump. The feeling of being watched never left. Hours passed, and with each minute, my unease grew stronger. I couldn't ignore the thought gnawing at me. What if they were still out there? Deciding I needed to know for sure, I bundled up and stepped outside again, determined to follow the tracks one last time. The snow had started falling heavier, covering parts of the footprints, but they were still visible enough to trace. I followed them cautiously, deeper into the woods, my breath quick and shallow. The stillness of the forest was deafening. Then I heard it. A single footstep, close, too close. I whipped my head around, eyes scanning the endless rows of trees. Nothing moved, but I felt it. Someone was there, watching me from behind the thick trunks. My chest tightened as I took a slow, careful step backward. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and for the first time I realized the horrifying truth. The footprints never led away from the cabin. Whoever, or whatever, had been out here might still be inside. Heart pounding, I turned and ran back to the cabin, the crunch of my boots in the snow louder than ever. I slammed the door shut behind me, double locking it this time. There was no way I was going outside again, no matter what. The fire in the stove flickered dimly, casting long shadows across the room, but the warmth did nothing to soothe the chill creeping up my spine. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I tried to steady myself. The thought of someone, or something, lurking in the woods just beyond the reach of the dim light filled my mind. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, only a blank screen mocking me. I was alone, completely alone. And then I heard it, a soft tap at the window. I froze, staring at the darkened pane. The snow outside was thick now, but I could make out the faint outline of a shadow moving in the distance. It didn't look like a person. It was something else. Too large. Too wrong. The tap came again, followed by a scratching sound, like claws dragging across glass. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but then it stopped. Silence. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing. No noise, no movement, only the heavy, suffocating silence of the cabin. And then, a whisper, "Let me in." Story 2. The fire crackled softly in the cold winter air as we sat around it, bundled up in thick jackets, enjoying the quiet of the snowy forest. The night stretched around us, silent and endless, with only the distant rustling of trees in the wind. It was our annual winter camping trip, just me and Justin deep in the woods, miles away from any sign of civilization. It was supposed to be peaceful, a break from everything, but something felt off tonight. As we sipped our drinks and talked about nothing in particular, a sound sliced through the stillness. A scream, distant yet sharp enough to send a shiver down my spine. We both froze, eyes locked on each other. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human, but there was something unnatural about it. We listened, holding our breath, but the forest fell silent again, as if it had never happened. Justin chuckled nervously, brushing it off as some weird echo or maybe just our imagination. I nodded, trying to do the same, but deep down a heavy feeling of unease settled in my chest. We had camped here many times before, but this time, something felt different. Something felt wrong. We tried to shake off the scream, convincing ourselves it was nothing more than a distant animal call. But the air felt heavier now, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through my nerves. Justin poked at the fire, his face tense but trying to act normal. I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. Then it came again, another scream, closer this time. My stomach dropped. It was louder, clearer, too human, yet still not quite right. We sat frozen, listening to the fading echo vanish into the darkness beyond the trees. Justin stood up, grabbing his flashlight, and I followed without thinking. We scanned the thick forest around us, the beam of light barely cutting through the dense snowflakes falling steadily. A cold wind swept through, carrying a faint whisper with it. My hands felt clammy despite the freezing air. I whispered to Justin, asking if we should check it out, hoping he'd say no. Instead, he nodded, his face serious. Slowly we stepped away from the fire, moving toward where the sound had come from, our boots crunching softly in the snow. The further we walked, the quieter it became. Too quiet. The only sound was our breathing, heavy and uncertain. And then, without warning, a third scream rang out, this time right behind us. We spun around, hearts racing, but the forest stood still. Nothing moved, no footprints, no sign of anything. just the same eerie, silent trees staring back at us. I felt a chill creep down my spine, and for the first time, I realized we might not be alone out here. Fear settled deep into my chest as we stood frozen in the snow, our flashlights trembling slightly in our hands. The woods around us felt suffocating, the tall trees pressing in closer, their dark silhouettes blending into the night. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could see the same fear in Justin's eyes. Neither of us wanted to say it, but we both knew something was out here with us. We took a cautious step back toward the camp, but just as we turned, our lights caught something in the snow. A dark shape, sprawled out, half buried under the fresh snowfall. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. A deer, its body twisted unnaturally, deep gashes sliced across its neck and sides. The cuts were clean, too precise to be the work of a predator. I felt bile rise in my throat as Justin whispered, "We need to go, now." But before we could move, a sound stopped us in our tracks. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow just beyond the trees. We aimed our flashlights toward the sound, and that's when we saw him. A man, standing barefoot in the snow, his clothes thin and ragged, his skin pale against the freezing night. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us with wide, empty eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. A shaky breath escaped my lips as he took a single step forward, the scream we had heard earlier. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't someone lost. It was him. And now he was here. My entire body locked up with fear as the man took another slow step forward, his bare feet sinking into the snow without a single sign of pain from the cold. His face was void of emotion, his lips slightly parted as if he was about to say something, but no words came. Just silence. The same kind of silence that had filled the woods all night. Justin grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and whispered, "Run." We didn't hesitate. We turned and sprinted through the snow, our breath coming out in ragged gasps, the icy air burning our lungs. The trees blurred past us, but the heavy crunch of footsteps behind us never faded. He was following. No matter how fast we moved, it felt like he was right there, just out of sight. My legs felt weak, but the fear kept me going, pushing me forward through the endless white. The sight of our campsite gave me a small spark of hope. We stumbled toward it, throwing everything into our bags without stopping to look back. Justin fumbled with the zipper, his hands shaking so badly it barely closed. My ears strained to listen, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the scream came again. Closer, so close it felt like it was right behind us. Without thinking, we bolted to the truck, Justin fumbling with the keys as I frantically looked around. My heart nearly stopped when I saw him, standing at the edge of the trees, barely lit by the glow of our dying fire. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us with that empty stare. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the snow-covered road without looking back. We never spoke about that night again. We never went back to that campsite. But sometimes, in the middle of a quiet winter night, I swear I can still hear that scream echoing in the distance. Story 3. The snow was falling lightly, covering the roads in a soft white layer as I drove through the quiet streets. It was late, and the town felt almost deserted, with only the glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car breaking the darkness. I was on my last delivery for the night, a simple food order that took me farther than I usually go. The address led me down a narrow road surrounded by tall, dark trees that seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. As I followed the GPS, the houses became fewer and farther apart, and soon I found myself at the end of a long driveway facing a small, old cabin. The lights inside were on, casting a dim glow through the frosted windows, but something about the place felt strange. It looked worn down, as if no one had lived there for a long time. Stepping out of the car, I could hear faint sounds coming from inside. Laughter. Not just one voice, but many, talking, laughing, overlapping. It was strange, almost too loud for such a small cabin. I stood there for a moment, hesitating, listening. The wind howled through the trees, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something about this delivery didn't feel right, but I shook it off and walked up to the door. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet night. The laughter inside continued, loud and chaotic, as if a party was in full swing. But no one answered. I knocked again, harder this time, shifting the bag of food in my hands. The voices carried on, but there was something odd about them, like they were too distant, too disconnected from the room beyond the door. After a long pause, the door creaked open. A man stood there, staring at me with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty. "Come in," he said, his voice too calm, too inviting. "They're waiting to thank you." I hesitated, glancing past him into the cabin. The room inside was small and barely furnished, nothing like what I'd expected from the noisy crowd I had heard. The chatter continued, but I couldn't see anyone. My stomach twisted in unease as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from a small radio sitting on the counter. Something was wrong. The man's smile never faded as he stepped aside, waiting for me to enter. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. "I'll just leave this here," I muttered, placing the bag on the doorstep. But as I turned to leave, the laughter inside the cabin suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I quickened my pace back to the car, my hands trembling. I didn't know what was going on inside that cabin, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I rushed back to my car, trying to stay calm, but my hands shook as I fumbled with the door handle. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the cabin. The man was still standing in the doorway, but now he wasn't alone. There were figures behind him, barely visible in the dim light. They stood unnaturally still, their faces hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that none of them had been there before. They hadn't made a sound. They just stood there, watching. The man's smile grew wider, almost unnatural, as if he could sense my fear. My heart pounded as I turned the key in the ignition, but it wouldn't start. Panic rose in my chest, and I tried again, hands sweating against the cold steering wheel. When I looked up, my stomach dropped. The man was now at the end of the driveway. I hadn't even seen him move. His eyes locked onto mine through the windshield, and for a moment I felt frozen, trapped in the eerie silence. My pulse thundered in my ears as the figures behind him took a slow step forward, their shapes shifting in the darkness. The engine finally roared to life, snapping me out of my paralysis. I floored the gas pedal, the tires skidding against the icy road. As I sped away, I forced myself to look back one last time. The cabin lights flickered, and just before they vanished into the distance, I saw the man, still standing there, still smiling. I drove faster than I ever had before, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. My heart pounded in my chest, and every shadow along the empty road felt like it was closing in on me. The snow swirled in my headlights, making it hard to see, but I didn't dare slow down. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. Who were those people? What were they doing out here? And why did it feel like they were waiting for me? As I reached the main road, I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm down. I checked my phone, my fingers shaking as I opened the delivery app. My stomach twisted into knots when I saw the address. It wasn't there. The order was gone. No record of it. No sign that I had ever been there at all. I felt sick. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and a chill ran down my spine. For a brief second, I thought I saw something. A dark figure standing at the edge of the road, just barely visible through the snow. I blinked, and it was gone. I kept driving, refusing to stop until I reached home. I deleted the app from my phone and promised myself I'd never take another late-night delivery again. But even now, when I'm alone at night, I still hear it, the faint echo of laughter, somewhere in the distance, growing closer every time. Story 4. The store was empty, just like every other night shift. The aisles stretched out in perfect silence, the only sounds coming from the dull hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old shelves. I was restocking the chips aisle, stacking bags mindlessly, counting down the hours until my shift ended. Outside, the snow fell in slow, lazy flakes, covering the empty parking lot in a thick white blanket. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. As I walked past the front of the store, something caught my eye. A figure stood outside, close to the glass, almost too close. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I stopped, feeling my chest tighten. The person didn't wave, didn't knock, just stood still, their face hidden under the shadow of the hood. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as someone waiting for a ride or just sheltering from the cold. But something about them felt off. I turned away, forcing myself to focus on work. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were still locked on me, watching every move I made. A few minutes passed, and when I finally worked up the nerve to glance back at the window, the figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a bit ridiculous for getting so worked up. Maybe they were just passing through, I told myself. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I moved through the aisles, adjusting items and wiping down shelves, but something felt different. The store, usually quiet and still, suddenly felt wrong. As I reached the back of the store, I noticed a few boxes had fallen off the shelves. They weren't just tipped over. They were scattered across the floor, like someone had knocked them down. I swallowed hard and knelt to pick them up, trying to ignore the growing unease creeping through my body. Then I heard it, a sound so soft it almost didn't seem real. A quiet laugh, deep and slow, coming from the back storage area. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the shelf. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I strained to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself it must have been the building settling, but deep down I knew better. I took slow, careful steps toward the storage room, the flickering lights overhead casting long, shifting shadows. The heavy metal door stood slightly open, and a cold draft whispered through the gap. I reached out to push it open wider, but something inside me screamed not to. My gut told me I wasn't alone in the store anymore. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to push it open. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, but I had to know. Slowly I nudged the door open just enough to peek inside. Darkness. The storage room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. My eyes scanned the rows of shelves stacked with supplies, but nothing seemed out of place. Just when I was about to turn away, a small shuffle echoed from behind the stacks. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Someone was there. I took a step back, and as I did, a low creak came from behind me. I spun around, and my stomach dropped. A figure stood at the end of the aisle, half hidden in the flickering light. He was tall, his face stretched into a wide, unsettling grin. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine with an eerie stillness. I stumbled back, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilting slightly as if studying me. My hands fumbled for my phone, but my fingers were shaking too much to dial. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, in the quiet, I heard it again. That slow, chilling laugh, creeping through the aisles, echoing in the empty store. And in that moment, I realized he had been inside the whole time. Panic took over, and I turned to run, my legs trembling beneath me. I sprinted down the aisle, my footsteps echoing through the empty store. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him behind me, feel his presence closing in. My hands fumbled with my keys as I reached the front doors, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately tried again, my hands slick with sweat. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched and twisted across the floor. A low whisper came from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I turned my head just enough to see him standing only a few feet away now, his grin wider, eyes locked onto me with an unnatural stillness. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he was waiting for me to stop struggling. In a burst of pure terror, I bolted for the emergency exit at the side of the store. My feet slipped on the tile, but I pushed forward, slamming into the door with all my weight. It burst open and I stumbled out into the freezing night, the cold air stinging my face. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, locking the doors and fumbling to start the engine. As I sped away, I glanced back through the windshield, my chest heaving with relief. The store was dark now, the lights completely off. But standing in the doorway, just barely visible in the moonlight, he was still there, watching. I never went back after that night. I quit the next morning without an explanation. But sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I still hear it. That slow, eerie laugh creeping through the silence, reminding me that some things should never be ignored.